Hello, this is Mark Wolf. I'm the director of the National Energy Assistance Directors Association, and I'd like to welcome everyone to our first webinar of the 2014 LIHEAP Training and Technical Assistance Series. Today's webinar is on LIHEAP weatherization and weatherization transfers. This is an issue of great importance. We've been discussing the role of weatherization in LIHEAP for a few years now, and today's webinar really starts to begin to look at the details, the issues in managing weatherization funds, and how it can really help connect with the overall goals of the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program. Our speakers today are Yulia Razad. Yulia is a program analyst for LIHEAP in the Office of Community Services. Her primary responsibilities are to serve as regional liaison for grantees in Regions 2 and 8, and to lead LIHEAP site visits. Prior to joining HHS, Yulia worked at a nonprofit in California, where she helped run the LIHEAP and weatherization programs. Susan Marshall will be our second speaker. Susan has been the Heating Assistance Program Coordinator in Alaska for the past 6 years. Prior to this position, she worked with the Tanana Chiefs Conference in Alaska as a TANF caseworker, as Community Outreach Representative for Northeast Utilities in Connecticut. Our third speaker is Nicole Silks. Nicole is Supervisor of Pennsylvania's LIHEAP Program's Vendor Unit. Her unit handles vendor enrollment in the LIHEAP program, provides assistance with vendor crisis claim submissions, and ensures vendors understand and comply with the LIHEAP program regulations. Nicole previously worked as an intake caseworker and a LIHEAP Policy Unit Program Specialist. I hope everyone finds today's session useful, and as I said, we'll be holding questions at the end. With that, I'll turn it over to our first speaker, Yulia Razad.
Thank you, Mark, for that kind introduction. And on behalf of the Office of Community Services, I'd also like to welcome everyone to our webinar. Today's webinar will be addressing the roles and responsibilities of grantees when it comes to the administration of weatherization services funded through LIHEAP. As most of you know, all LIHEAP grantees, states, tribes, and territories have the option to transfer up to 15% of LIHEAP funds for weatherization services. And then each year after April 1st, those grantees that wish to do so may submit a waiver to our office to request to spend up to 25% of their LIHEAP funds for weatherization services. Grantees have a kind of a broad set of flexibilities when it comes to administering weatherization through LIHEAP funds, because in the vast majority of cases, LIHEAP weatherization is administered either in coordination or in cooperation with the Department of Energy Weatherization Assistance Program. Some grantees, for the sake of simplicity and administrative ease, choose to operate LIHEAP weatherization using entirely all of the same rules as those that apply to the Department of Energy Weatherization Program. Other grantees who wish to have some added flexibility for LIHEAP funding choose to use primarily Department of Energy rules, but with some exceptions for LIHEAP. Grantees also have the option to use primarily LIHEAP rules with some DOE exceptions, or use entirely LIHEAP rules. So I want to take this opportunity to note that the concept of LIHEAP rules for weatherization is not very well defined in the LIHEAP statute. So if a grantee wishes to use primarily or entirely LIHEAP rules to administer weatherization with LIHEAP funding, they are then responsible for developing those rules. And at the very least, we expect that the rules include protocols for quality control, training, inspection, and installation of measures, just to name a few areas. Grantees have the option to administer LIHEAP themselves directly, or to pass a portion of their funds for the purposes of weatherization to a second state agency. In cases where that happens, that is usually because the primary LIHEAP grantee does not receive Department of Energy weatherization funding, and so they pass their weatherization funds to the agency within their state government that operates the Department of Energy Weatherization Assistance Program. We have certain expectations when it comes to LIHEAP grantees transferring funds from one state agency to another to administer weatherization. At the very least, we expect that when this funds transfer occurs, it is accompanied by a formal agreement. We would like that for this formal agreement to cover, at minimum, reporting requirements, financial tracking requirements, and monitoring requirements. LIHEAP grantees are still responsible for monitoring the implementation of the weatherization funds by the second state agency that they pass the funds to. They are not absolved of that responsibility. So they are required to monitor the second state agency to ensure that they are properly obligating the funds, expending them on valid weatherization measures, and are following the terms of the formal agreement that they set up. LIHEAP grantees continue to be responsible for tracking funds even after they transfer them to a second state agency. HHS does not consider funds obligated when they are transferred from one state agency to another. We only consider funds obligated when the state agency that receives the funds obligates them to subgrantees or obligates them at the state level for administrative expenses. Because the timing of these obligations affects things like the carryover report, a LIHEAP grantee must receive information from the second state agency that it transfers funds to regarding the obligation of funds and must ensure that the obligation of those funds meets the timelines required in the LIHEAP statute. Finally, we strongly recommend that if a LIHEAP grantee transfers weatherization funds to a second state agency, that they also transfer an amount of their administrative dollars to that agency for the purposes of administering weatherization. We do not believe that there is such a thing as a weatherization program with no administrative or overhead costs. Even if a LIHEAP grantee wishes for their funds to only be spent on the materials for weatherization activities, the purchase, inventorying, and tracking of those materials comes with an administrative cost. It is important that these administrative costs be tracked because the LIHEAP statute prohibits the expenditure of more than 10% of LIHEAP funds on administrative costs. And if those costs exceed 10%, the LIHEAP statute does not allow for other federal funds to be used to pay for those costs. So if a state agency is using its DOE money to cover the administrative costs associated with administering LIHEAP weatherization, those funds count toward the overall 10% LIHEAP administrative cost cap. So that's why we recommend that not only weatherization funds be transferred on their own, but also some portion of the administrative funds go along with those weatherization dollars. And if a grantee still chooses not to allow the second state agency to spend any of its funding on administrative costs, then it must require that that state agency pay for the administrative costs associated with LIHEAP weatherization with non-federal funds, and in its monitoring of that agency, ensure that that is what's happening. My contact information is here if anyone has questions at the end, and about these basic concepts that I've covered in terms of HHS expectations of grantee roles and responsibilities for weatherization. And now I'm going to hand it over to Susan Marshall to talk to us about how weatherization works in Alaska.
Thank you, Yulia, and thank you, everybody, for asking me to come on to the phone call today and tell you about how weatherization works in Alaska. As part of my presentation, I plan to cover some basic information about our weatherization program. I'll go over our memorandum of agreement, data exchanges, and last but not least, talk a little bit about what rules we use here in Alaska, DOE versus LIHEAP. I'm going to start with basic information. Here in Alaska, the Department of Public Assistance administers the LIHEAP program, both the winter and the crisis assistance programs, and we do not run a cooling program. We do turn our money over to Alaska Housing Finance Corp. They are the agency that oversees weatherization in Alaska, and any funds we designate for weatherization from our block grant including funds to repair inoperable equipment, are sent to AHFC to administer, with one exception that I'll get into a little later in the presentation. Funds are distributed to AHFC through a reimbursable service agreement and to the tribes through provider agreements. And once again, I'll get into how we transfer some money to the tribes for weatherization a little later in the presentation. And Alaska Housing Finance Corp is actually, their weatherization is funded through multiple sources, which allows them a lot of flexibility here in the state as to how they spend their money. A portion of the state's LIHEAP block grant is sent to Alaska Housing Finance Corp. They have our LIHEAP leveraging funds, which we turn over for weatherization, DOE funds, state general funds that our legislature earmarks for weatherization, and money earned from mortgages that Alaska Housing Finance Corp offers. They offer home choice programs as well as low-income subsidized apartments. So weatherization is a small portion, well, actually a fairly decent portion of what Alaska Housing Finance Corp does, but their mission is to assist low-income households with either renting or owning. All the work is performed by Alaska Housing Finance Corp subcontractors across the state. They work with 5 main weatherization contractors and a number of housing authorities. The 5 main weatherization contractors serve primarily the whole state, and housing authorities, of course, work with their own tenants. And subcontractors are awarded a percentage of our LIHEAP dollars to be used for heating systems replacements and other health and safety items. We do not end up giving any money to the housing authorities, just to the 5 main subcontractors that work for Alaska Housing Finance Corp. HFC spends an average of $11,000 in materials and services for every home they weatherize on the road system, and $30,000 in materials and services for every home they weatherize off the road system. And the reason that they can afford to spend that kind of money is that they leverage all their funds that I mentioned in the previous slide, and they also try to do as much work as they can when they're in a community, because they probably won't be going back for a number of years. As you can see, Alaska is a pretty large state, and we have many remote villages that are accessible only by boat or plane. And that's one of the reasons that our weatherization contractors target particular communities. They try to go and visit a community and do all the homes that they can in that community while they're there. They do that because it's very cost effective to bring in labor to do it all at one time, and also because half of the weatherization costs in rural Alaska are earmarked for shipping. And if they can bulk order materials and get things to a village, it does reduce time and expense of shipping individual orders. They're able to spend more money in each of the individual homes. As I mentioned earlier, Alaska also has 13 tribes, and they're funded directly from ACF that administer LIHEAP. They choose how much of their block grant to set aside for weatherization and how to use it. So the money that I set out of my block grant that goes to Alaska Housing Finance Corp is earmarked to weatherize across the state. The tribes generally deal with their local housing authorities when they're administering their weatherization services. In addition to allocating a portion of LIHEAP block grant, we use our leveraging funds, and this is the exception to the rule here. Because Alaska is such a large state and we're spread out so much, and when the weatherization providers go out, they try to target a whole community. They don't have the resources to then fly back out to a community to look at one heating system. And it was determined through conversations with our tribal providers that they could best serve some of their remote villages through existing contacts and resources they had available. So when we get our leveraging award here in Alaska, it's split 50-50 between Alaska Housing Finance Corp and our tribes. And the tribes can apply for that funding to replace inoperable heating systems, and they do that through a provider agreement. And we only share our leveraging funding with the tribes. We do not share our block grant weatherization funding with the tribes. And that may be changing in the near future because more of our tribes are interested in doing their own leveraging. So that scenario might change a little bit. That's pretty much it for the basic program. We do collaborate with Alaska Housing Finance Corp in a number of ways. We serve on each other's policy advisory committees, And that does allow us an opportunity to comment on the process and procedures, to learn about funding levels, and to develop working relationships with the subcontractors. This helps a lot if we have to go out and look at a property or call them about a problem, which isn't very often, but it helps to have that one-on-one and to know who we're dealing with. And then we meet with AHFC staff throughout the year. If we're in each other's communities, we stop and we update each other. It's an ongoing relationship. Next, I'm going to cover our memorandum of agreement, and this is really important if you're handing your money off to somebody because it details the purpose of the agreement, it outlines the responsibilities and duties, and it protects your state against liability. It's always great to have everything spelled out. The next slides I'm going to go through are our actual memorandum of agreement with Alaska Housing Finance Corp., and I'm going to go through the different sections to talk about their significance and their importance. And a copy of this is going to be made available as a handout. So as we start off here, our memorandum agreement starts off with a purpose. What's the purpose of what we're doing here? Why are we working together? And it allows block grantees the option of using grant funds to provide weatherization or other energy-related home repairs for eligible households. So it's basically talking about, the purpose is to serve people through the low-income home energy block grant and provide weatherization through our weatherization providers, and we also outline here how we're going to be paying them, which is through a reimbursable service agreement, and basically our funds are meant to augment their LIHEAP program. It also establishes conditions for an exchange of client eligibility information, and this is very important. We do exchange information on a monthly basis as far as who is eligible for the program, and it helps build public awareness of both programs. Next section of our memorandum of agreement are our responsibilities, and we start off with what the Department of Health and Social Services responsibilities are, and basically that we're going to execute the RSA to provide funding, and we're going to provide a list of the residents to Alaska Housing Finance Corp. And their subcontractors. And once again, that's done on a monthly basis. It's done through a data download into an Excel spreadsheet, which is then sent under secure messaging, so it's encrypted and sent to the subcontractors. And AHFC's responsibilities are that they're going to use capable grantees to provide weatherization services, meaning that they can do the work, they have insurance, and they've had training. Households receiving weatherization services funded under this program must have a gross annual income of 60% of the current median income. And this is different than what we actually use for our cash benefit program. For the benefit program, we use 150% of the poverty income guidelines, but for weatherization, we go up to 60% of the state median income. Last but not least, we do say in our agreement that they are allowed to provide weatherization services to households across the whole state, not just in the DHSS territory. And part of that relates back to the fact that we leverage for the whole state, so the money needs to be spent to serve the whole state. The next clause in the agreement goes over the protection of client information, and this is very important. As we all know, confidentiality is very important in our area, and we want to be able to protect all of our client information. So they're basically agreeing that they will do that. They're not going to duplicate or disseminate the list. They're not going to hand out the information. They're going to destroy and dispose of it in a confidential manner. Basically outlines what we want them to do with that client information, what they can and cannot do. We also list in here the dates that those expenditures that money needs to be either expended or obligated. And in our case, it's between October 1st and September 30th. And that they can obligate the funds by September 30th, but they must have spent it by December 31st. We also designate in here that grantees will use non-federal funds, I just realized there's a typo there, for administrative and planning costs incurred in the management and oversight of LIHEAP activities. So as Julia was saying, if we choose not to transfer administrative funds, our funds, the funds for administration must come from non-federal sources. That's right here in our memorandum of agreement. And it goes over to say exactly what we will cover here, that we will cover labor and materials and audits, pre-audits, post-audits, health and safety inspections, and goes on to spell out everything there. Last but not least, we're saying that we want financial audits of those funds and a copy of their federal single audit each year. And we want them to provide us with information each year so that we can do our household report. And we've listed here exactly what we want from them. We also need to know that they're going to provide an opportunity for a fair hearing or fair review of any complaints, either in being qualified for the work or in the work that was done at the home. As I've said several times, we do have data exchanges. Once a month, we send a list of all awards to the weatherization subcontractors. They actually use that to pre-qualify the households as well as to prioritize them. So they look at our list, and if there's an elder, disabled, or a family with young children, they jump to the top of the list. And it includes name, address, phone number, income levels, and whether or not there's a vulnerable member in the household. Each August, I ask the subcontractors to send me a list with the following information, and this is what I use for my household report. I know it's a little small, but basically we're asking for a client name, address, social security number, whether or not they received heating assistance, their percent of poverty, whether a vulnerable member lived in the household, did they replace the heating system, the cost of the material, labor, total, vendor used, and the reason for the replacement. This helps me with the household report as well as reporting what we have done with weatherization. And in the case of the new performance measures that are coming up, it will help me report which units were inoperable and that we were able to restore power to those households. We also ask for that information again in December to see if there was any additional work that was completed prior to the end of the year so that we can send in a final household report in December. The reports that they send us also allow me the opportunity to see exactly how they've spent our money, which is very helpful in tracking. In Alaska, we primarily use the Department of Energy rules, but we do have some flexibility with LIHEAP funding and the state funding to provide other measures that might not be included under DOE. And thank you for your time. If you have any questions about this presentation, this is my contact information, and we will also be saving questions to the end of this presentation, so I'll answer them then. But if you think of any tonight or tomorrow or the next day, this is how you can reach me. And thank you again. I will now turn the presentation over to Nicole Silks. Nicole?
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Susan. Again, I'm Nicole Silks from the Pennsylvania LIHEAP Vendor Unit, and I'm going to talk today a little bit about the Pennsylvania Crisis Interface and our weatherization monitoring plan. Things I'm going to cover today are the background of Pennsylvania's what we call Crisis Interface Program, key monitoring objectives, and the tracking of funds between the two agencies. So in Pennsylvania, the LIHEAP program is administered by two separate state agencies. The Department of Public Welfare, DPW, administers the LIHEAP cash and crisis portion of the LIHEAP block grant. The Department of Community and Economic Development, DCED, administers the Crisis Interface Program. What the Crisis Interface Program, it's an integration where a portion of the LIHEAP funds allocated for weatherization will be used to alleviate specific LIHEAP crises. The types of crises that are included are furnace replacement, repair of a heating system, the repair of gas or other fuel lines, the replacement of an inoperable heating system, the repair of broken windows, the only time we repair broken windows is in conjunction with the repair of a heating system or a replacement of a heating system, and also pipe thawing services. LIHEAP households with weather-related emergencies will be eligible to receive more expensive type of services provided through the Crisis Interface project, and an average of $6,500 is available to households for these weatherization services. Referrals for both the Crisis Interface Program and the Standard Weatherization are sent from the local county assistance offices, the CAOs, to the local weatherization agencies. Applicants indicate on their application whether they are interested in standard weatherization services or whether they are in a crisis situation where they may not have heat due to a broken heating source. And those referrals are sent directly from the CAOs. The CAOs are responsible to determine the eligibility and identify the type of crisis and service needed. And then once the referral is made, the agency that receives the referral will either make a home visit for an evaluation as to what type of service is needed and to resolve the crisis, or provide an assessment for weatherization services. DPW transfers the full 15% of our block grant to DCED to administer the Crisis Interface Program and for standard weatherization. Standard weatherization happens after the LIHEAP program is over. So our program normally runs November 1st through the end of April, or a date in April. And so during that period of time, we just run the Crisis Interface portion of the program, and then after the LIHEAP program is ended, standard weatherization services are performed on the LIHEAP-eligible households with the LIHEAP funds. Next, I'm going to talk about the key monitoring objectives that DCED and DPW use to monitor the weatherization program. The first item is the timeliness and accuracy of referrals and services. They track whether the referral was sent to the weatherization agency within 24 hours of determining eligibility. They make sure the referral form is complete and accurate enough to enable the grantee to properly assist the crisis client. For life-threatening referrals, they ensure that they are properly noted and handled within 18 hours, and they make sure that the proper permissions were received, as in whether or not it was a rental property or somebody else owns the home that they need to perform the weatherization services on. It is the responsibility of the weatherization agency to address the crisis within that 48 hours, or if there is a life-threatening situation within the 18 hours. This does not mean that repair must be made within that time frame. Instead, the weatherization agency is responsible to document that the staff have discussed with the households the time frames needed to complete the necessary repairs or replacements. The staff must also resolve that the household has a safe place to go until the crisis is over, or that they were provided with a supplemental heater to use until the crisis has been resolved. In some circumstances, it may just be finding them a warm place to stay that day until the crisis is resolved. The next item for review is the key monitoring objectives is funding and availability. They make sure that the money was used for crisis repairs and replacements first, and not for standard weatherization, and make sure that the services were only provided to eligible applicants, and that they've provided the services within the time frame the program is operating, and that the spending was monitored. They make sure that they don't run out of money too soon, and that the services provided 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And there is a process in place for DPW to notify DCED if the anticipated spending will exceed funding and when funding is exhausted, or when funding is getting close to be exhausted. DPW and DCED have monthly meetings to review trends, review funding, and to answer each other's questions. And if funding is close to being exhausted, meeting intervals are increased. so we'll go to a weekly or biweekly meeting to determine, to discuss those items. And also, our budget office reviews the spending weekly to ensure each agency is within allowed spending limits, and they pay special attention to administrative costs. The next key monitoring objective is reporting. Each local weatherization agency must submit a monthly budget report to DCED, and all data elements about each job completed are entered into a reporting system called the Hancock Energy Software. This level of information allows for trends to be identified and for quicker action to be taken if an agency is doing something incorrectly. This can be viewed by DCED at any time, and examples of the information entered include whether the job was a repair or replacement, the name of the subcontractor, the type of the repair, the cost of the job, and the client demographic information. All the monthly data is then compiled into a year-end report for each agency and combined agency report showing statewide totals. Another key monitoring objective is internal and external monitoring. DCED has an internal monitoring team that does season reviews of all agencies. They review the average job cost, the number of jobs completed, and whether or not how many repairs versus replacements there were. In addition to internal monitoring and tracking done by DCED, DPW also contracts with an outside agency to review the LIHEAP weatherization program. The monitoring teams review reports and numbers the agencies submit, and having an outside group review the procedures and specifics of the crisis interface between our two agencies has been helpful in determining what we are doing right and where we need to improve. And that same agency also does a yearly review of the LIHEAP program at our county assistance offices. This screenshot, and I believe it's going to be sent out as a handout, is an excerpt from a review checklist that DCED uses to monitor its agencies. There's actually, I believe, 12 questions that they use to review. The next item I'm going to discuss is tracking spending. DCED uses multiple reports and tracking tools to monitor the spending of their weatherization agencies. And examples of those reports include the job cost report, the budget workbook, and the invoice workbook. There is a job cost report for each individual agency and a statewide report as well. The budget workbook includes justifications, summaries, and actual figures. The invoice workbook includes a DOE invoice, a LIHEAP invoice, accrued costs, and total expenditures for each funding, and a closeout invoice for year-end reporting. And the next couple of slides are illustrations of these reports. This is an example of a job cost report, and this is the yearly data for one agency. And this is the compilation that is assembled, that DCED assembles from the ATS system for an individual agency, and it details the type of work being completed and how much was spent on each item. So this just lists things like air filters and chimney repairs and replacement of a heating unit. This excerpt is from the budget workbook and shows tracking of costs such as operating costs, labor costs, insurance costs, and it also defines DOE and LIHEAP expenditures for each agency. This next item is the invoice workbook, and DCED requires that each agency complete this workbook, and they report monthly, and the report also tracks cumulative spending. And inside of this invoice workbook, there's multiple tabs. It's like an Excel spreadsheet. DCED and DPW both report LIHEAP spending to the same accounting system, which is SAP. Budget Operations updates administration funding every Monday based on expenditures reported by DCED and DPW to the SAP system. Budget Operations compiles a full-scale report of all administration costs and other expenditures every 2 weeks to consistently monitor the LIHEAP spending. DCED charges all agency-reported weatherization expenditures to the SAP accounting system using grant accounting codes. So we're both reporting to the same system using the same codes so they know which portion of the funding we're pulling from, be it administrative costs or program costs. 10% of our total LIHEAP block grant is assigned to administration costs for DCED and DPW. And budget uses the coding in the Commonwealth accounting system to track that administrative expenditures of both agencies are staying within the 10% allocation. And budget also uses SAP to track spending to be sure we are staying within our total allocation. This next screenshot is an example of the different account codes and how they're entered in as a commitment item and using the general ledger numbers to make sure that they're assigned correctly to the right administrative expenditure. And this final slide is another excerpt of a tracking report that shows commitments and expenditures for personnel costs, operating costs, grants to our crisis contractor agencies, and how the costs are across the board. That was a brief overview of the tracking of LIHEAP spending in Pennsylvania, and that's my email address if you have anything that you'd like to follow up on outside of the question and answer period. So thank you again for having me speak. And I think I'm going to turn it back over to Cass.
Yep, thank you, Nicole. Now we're going to turn it over to John Markey, who's with DBG Conferencing, to do a question and answer session, and he's going to give you instructions on how to do that. John, can you take it from here?
Looks like our first question is from Larry. Larry, hold on one moment. We'll answer your question.
Hello, this is Larry Dawson from Illinois. It's a question for Nicole. In your presentation, you talked about hiring an external agency or organization to monitor your LIHEAP weatherization program. Is that another nonprofit, or is it an audit firm? How do you go about securing those services?
It's an accounting firm that we use. It's not a nonprofit, and we place the job out for bid and pick that firm.
Thank you.
Our next question comes from Nick Sunday.
Yes, I'm a Native State Advisor, but I apologize if I missed this. Both the Alaska and Pennsylvania, in your state plan, did you use the DOE regulations or the LIHEAP regulations for your weatherization?
Nick, this is Susan, and in Alaska we use primarily the DOE.
Thank you.
Yep, the same for Pennsylvania, except for the 20% of the health and safety regulations. Sometimes it'll be decreased.
Thank you.
Okay, I actually had a quick question for Nicole. If I heard you correctly, you mentioned that your weatherization program begins after your LIHEAP program is over. Does that mean that you only provide weatherization assistance in the summer? And if so, how does that work, and why is it set up that way, if you know?
The program, in order to be sure that we have enough funding to run the crisis portion of the program, crisis weatherization throughout our program, we run that concurrently. And then afterwards, once we have done all the crisis weatherization, we go back to do standard weatherization on all the LIHEAP eligible households. So it could start as early as March if they see that if the agencies see that they haven't used all of their funding that was allocated to them, they can start standard weatherization during that time period. It just depends on the amount of funding that the agencies have used. Is that?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Looks like Larry Dawson has an additional follow-up question. Hold on.
Hi, this is John Knox from Illinois, here with Larry as well. My question for both states is, does your delegate agency or the agency you transfer the funds to, do you give them monitoring requirements in terms of inspecting actual work? And what is that requirement? What percentage of work, and just generally what type of inspection?
Well, here in Alaska, as I had said, I sit on their policy advisory committee, and I'm in tune with what's going on. We don't actually have monitoring requirements. We defer to their existing monitoring requirements. We don't specify that in our memorandum of agreement. However, we do make sure that they are monitoring and doing what they're supposed to do. Because our funds are a small portion of their overall funds, we don't get to drive the car. We ride in the car, basically.
Yeah, in Pennsylvania, each agency, basically, we defer to them to follow their own standards as to how many they go back to check. I know that on that checklist, and I don't have the entire checklist in front of me, that is one of the items that they do review as to whether or not did they go back to review the work. So I think more often than not they do go back to review what was done at the house and if the client was, satisfied and if all the work was done correctly.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. The slide I currently have up has some additional information on weatherization and where you can get it. We all know and love the LIHEAP Clearinghouse website. They have some good information on weatherization, including breakdowns of how much is transferred by state, whether or not the weatherization program is run by LIHEAP or a different agency, in that case, what agency, and some more examples of memorandum of understanding between different state agencies. You can also feel free to contact me if you have any follow-up questions, or the speakers individually, and then the bottom link is just the contact page for the Administrators for Children and Families, so you can contact Yulia or any of the other ACF people through that. So thank you once again to Yulia, Susan, and Nicole for taking time out of their day to present, and have a good afternoon.